Hi, this is Emily Freitag, and I'm very excited to be joined today by Tiffany Neill, who is the Deputy Superintendent of Curriculum and Instruction for Oklahoma. And Tiffany, we are going to be talking about a range of topics, but among others, we're going to talk a little bit about science today. So as we do with all of these conversations, would love for you to just start with a story from your own journey as a learner and what that has taught you about learning.
Oh, well, wonderful. So I guess I have a long story to share about my learning experience from student to adulthood. But I would say I always had an interest in science. I always found the natural world to be interesting. So I grew up on a farm part-time, and so I was always interacting with the natural world and found a lot of curiosities there. But I also found that in the school setting, I was really good at science instruction when it came to being able to take quality notes and regurgitate that information for the purposes of assignments or quizzes or tests. And I took a lot of pride in the notes that I took and the scaffolds I put into those notes. That also helped me progress through college to a certain point in my core science courses. And when I got to a certain point in more of the advanced science courses, I recognized that I really lacked some of the conceptual understandings of science that would allow me to really think critically in the settings that I might have been in. For example, in my biochemistry class or my organic chemistry class, no longer could I sort of get by remembering things short term to then regurgitate that information. So I recognized in college that was problematic for me, but somehow I managed to sort of get by, even knowing that I still probably didn't have complete understandings of science concepts. And I was certainly aware of my lack of that. It actually wasn't until I began teaching that I started to recognize that there was a certain way that students learn naturally in a science classroom or in other classrooms. And what I mean by that is that it began to be apparent to me, specifically in the teaching setting I was in early on, which was in an alternative education setting, that if students engaged with something that allowed them to connect to their own worlds, they could draw on background experiences and understandings to help them understand this new piece of content or concepts that I was trying to teach them in science. And I say that's important in my own learning experience because, remember, I recognized for myself in college that there was something in the way of deep learning I was missing out on. And I started to see naturally with these students that the only productive way of learning was by engaging them in something that was familiar that they could connect to and then introducing the new concepts. When I went on to receive my master's in science education, I took my first science methods course. And that's really where I started to understand the science behind learning and why those kids that I had been teaching for 2 years seemed to learn naturally. That's how I termed it. But for me, the entire spectrum of the science of learning opened up in my master's courses, because in my undergraduate, I did not have any education courses. So I began to understand why those students and myself learned better and more deeply if the learning was connected to something that was personal or that I could experience. And I started to really understand that if students or myself could connect to a background experience, meaning all of that background information that I had available, that I could begin to really see where I had gaps in my own understanding. And it was a realization that when I had that specific gap, now I needed to fill that gap or that missing piece to help move forward in deeper understanding or explaining, maybe what I might have been observing in a science investigation. But really, to tell you the truth, my full evolution as a learner came about through the course of the Framework for K-12 Science Education, which is the National Academy's document that was published a few years ago that guides many of our science classrooms now nationally. Mm-hmm. And certainly that document informed our own state standards for science at the Oklahoma level. But when the framework came out and I began to read it, I also had the opportunity to go through several sessions or series of professional learning sessions with a gentleman by the name of Brett Molding, who was an author of the framework for K through 12 science education. And when I would go through his professional development, he would engage us in investigations of phenomenon or those natural events that happen in the world, or set up situations to mirror those events. And often he would engage us in phenomenon that were closely related to maybe the science of earth and space science, which I didn't have a strong background in. And through those experiences of engaging with a phenomenon and really thinking about what do I know, or can I begin to explain from my own background experiences about that phenomenon, and then being provided additional learning opportunities where I could take new pieces of knowledge and add to my current understanding to further explain that phenomenon, really set me on a path of fully understanding that for science, in order for students or myself as a learner to learn deeply, you really have to be able to investigate a phenomenon and work towards explaining that phenomenon. And that entire process of investigating and explaining a phenomenon, really, the deep learning happens when you as a learner or I as a learner can gather more information to refine our thinking, to add to our thinking, to develop more complex ways of understanding and knowing to explain that phenomenon. So really that truly impacted me in the field of science education, as well as me as a learner. Mm-hmm. So I hope that isn't too long of an answer, but that's my evolution as a learner.
Great to hear. Very, very good to hear. So take us into the kind of present time with the focus on science. And I think, people listening to this may come from a background of lots of different kind of understandings of NGSS or the National Academy of Science framework. Feel free to take us into anything that you think is relevant in the construct of that. But what I really want to understand is, what do we know works in the job of teaching science well? And you've touched on that some in your story, but we're trying to get at an understanding of what we need to be holding on to in this time and prioritizing. And I'd love your perspective on that, both as just an educator yourself, and as a scientist.
Sure. Well, I think what we have to hold on to is that we engage students in investigating and explaining phenomenon, or investigating and developing design solutions. And that's a little different, and it certainly was a shift in my understanding of what quality science learning was. And for years, we had all realized that inquiry-based science, or hands-on science as it's often termed, is a great way for students to learn. But I would say there's a level of sort of sophistication that develops when you begin to structure your science classroom, teaching more towards this vision of the framework for K through 12 science education, or the next generation science standards. And what that shift really means is that we're not setting up opportunities for students to walk through steps of a laboratory investigation and be able to sort of repeat the steps to get an outcome. Now, in that situation, students are hands-on. They are doing things with their hands. But what often can be missing from a structure like that is we don't ask students to think about what's causing that outcome that they see. Sometimes we're more focused on the steps that they take to get the outcome that we expect, right? Or to analyze data from the outcome. But really, it's that outcome of the investigation, or that phenomenon that's presented, that is our starting point for students in deep learning in science, in a way where they'll hold on to it and they'll be able to make connections between the learning they have and a novel or new situation, which is what we hope for students. So let me give you an example of this. So actually, I'll give you an example with my son. So when he was in middle school, I was really deep into supporting teachers in our state with this vision for science education of investigating phenomena and working to explain phenomenon. So I would always try those sort of things out on my son. And so I noticed one day that we had two different cups sort of sitting in the cup holder in my Jeep. And he had a plastic cup and I had a paper cup. And there were different amounts of liquid on the outside of each one of those cups. And so I just asked him, I said, hey, what do you notice about these two cups and the liquid on the outside of them? And he started to share his observations. And almost naturally, he began to ask questions about why were there differences, or Mom, why is there liquid on the outside of that cup anyway? Is it seeping outside the cup? And why wouldn't it be seeping out sort of in the plastic and paper in the same way? Which led us down a path together to try to collect some additional information related to that, right? So we tried out those same cups, we put different amounts of ice water in them, and we began to look at when did the liquid show up, where is the liquid showing up, and what he began to notice is where the liquid was the coldest, so where that ice was, that's where the liquid on the outside of the cup began to show up in more in more droplets. And at that point, I was able to, with all of that data he had collected, now remember, he's still got questions. He can't figure out why the liquid's on the outside of the cup. But then I, as his mom and teacher, I was able to bring some information to him that helped him understand that the liquid wasn't seeping out of the cup, but it was really the temperature difference right there where the ice was in the cup compared to the air outside the cup that caused water that was in the atmosphere to change into liquid form, which opened up a whole world of possibilities for him to think about, does that same thing happen when it comes to dew, or when I see liquid show up in this space? And he began to then attempt to have some really sophisticated ways to explain those other situations or phenomenon. Now, what's missing in the example I just gave you is that if we were in a classroom setting, the conversations I was having with him back and forth, he would have with his peers. So other students his age with different background experiences would be able to bring those to bear, in his conversation. So he's learning from their background experiences, trying to make sense of how this is working and why it's working. And at the moment he can't go any further, I then, as the teacher, bring forward some information that helps him, again, add to and refine his thinking. Now, again, that's different than maybe the way I engaged in laboratory experiences as a student in middle school, where I might have gone through steps to get an outcome, and then the teacher might have shared with me some science content related to that. See, the deep sense making I missed out on, but he gets that. He gets that opportunity, which means now he's going to retain that and he can apply it in all kinds of settings. So, Erin, I hope that responds a little bit.
It's so helpful. I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, and having young boys exploring this world has made me an even more passionate advocate for just the importance of good science education, because it's so clearly how they're processing the world. And so I do hear from lots of teachers, though, a sense of, well, that's all nice and good, but I have a lot to cover. Like, there's a lot in this standard. Tell us how you respond to teachers that have a sense of possibly feeling like that's in conflict with either how they learned science themselves, or in conflict with kind of how their time is designed.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's one we get often at the state level position. So, the thing I first encourage teachers to do, especially if they're worried about coverage and time allotment, if each of the teachers who are listening today were to take a strong look at their state standards, and if they're in a state that perhaps that state adopted the next generation science standards, or a state that those standards were informed by the next generation science standards and the framework for K-12 science education, what they might really find is that breadth of content that they may have been used to teaching for years, if you take a deeper look at your standards, you might notice that that breadth of content is not really there. Or you may wonder, is it hidden in there and I can't really see all of these terms or concepts that I have been teaching? Is that what this means? So for example, when it comes to students understanding, let's say, the concepts behind photosynthesis, right? So previously, when I had taught photosynthesis myself as a teacher, maybe in my state standards, there were all these terms that it seemed students needed to be familiar with. And I might have taught the steps in the process of photosynthesis in a high, sort of a high degree. But if I take a look at those same standards now around the concepts for photosynthesis, it really is about the conceptual understanding of why photosynthesis occurs, how it relates to other things, but it's not in detail the steps of photosynthesis. So now I can spend more time engaging students in an investigation that is phenomenon-based to help them understand just the central ideas related to that process and why it occurs and how it supports plants and connects to animals and all of those sort of things. So really what you might find is that a lot of the things you've been teaching or continuing to teach, that actually may not be a part of your expectation at that grade level any longer. Either it's been moved, which is not as likely, but more is the case that the expectations have been condensed to really focus on big ideas in science. And big ideas are not a plethora of terms and steps in a process, but they are really what we hope big ideas mean, those big central ideas that students can walk away with from their PK through 12 experience. So I always say to teachers, take a deep look at your standards and understand their intent. And for many states now, they do provide some supplemental guidance. I know in Oklahoma, we provide the Oklahoma Science Curriculum Frameworks, where we've worked with teachers in our state to help further assist teachers in understanding the intent of the standards or the goals of those standards. But once you understand that you may not have to teach everything that you have been teaching, and you then take a look at your curriculum that you have access to. And many of us in science education have had access to a textbook as our curriculum. And we've known for many years that what's provided in those textbooks is oftentimes way more than what is expected at our grade level. So I think you got to take a look at that and reduce down just to the big ideas or the concepts related to science. And now for most states, their standards are, again, the next generation science standards or informed by those standards in the framework for K through 12 science education, which means their standards have 3 dimensions: disciplinary core ideas or science concepts, science ideas, science and engineering practices, which are the practices we want students to engage in that mirror what scientists and engineers do, like asking questions, planning and carrying out investigations, arguing from evidence, constructing explanations, and cross-cutting concepts, which are my new favorite sort of addition to the science education discussion. And these are really the ways of thinking that we want students to gain that mirror the way that scientists and engineers think. And what I mean by that is, if, like my son, looked at those 2 cups and noticed that there was liquid on the outside, but the patterns were different, that difference in pattern may have triggered for him what's causing that to happen. So patterns and cause and effect are cross-cutting concepts. So we're trying to get students to develop those thinking skills like scientists and engineers with that 3rd dimension. So again, if there are 3 dimensions of your standards, it means 2/3 of your standards are engaging kids in doing science and engineering and engaging them in thinking like scientists and engineers. So if you are really focusing on students investigating phenomenon, you're covering 2/3 of your standards. Now it's just about ensuring they have those big science ideas. Again, take a real good look at your standards, pare down that curriculum to focus on that. And sometimes that means giving up maybe your favorite activity. I hate to say that, but I know a couple of investigations I always loved But when I was teaching high school biology, I recognized that those were really not at my grade level or associated with what I was teaching. And that's valuable time. That's what I always tell teachers, like, your time is extremely valuable. Your student learning time is extremely valuable. You have to focus on those most important aspects, because remember, those students are going to move on to subsequent grade levels. And that might be the grade where they get your favorite investigation. But you need to spend time at your grade level on the things that are a focus for your grade for those students.
And take us a little bit into how the idea of unfinished learning in science might be best supported. So I know a lot of teachers are worried about the gaps created maybe last spring. What advice do you have, or what are ways that as an educator you might think about how to prioritize instructional decisions given potential unfinished learning?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And it may seem like an idealistic answer here to begin with, but in science, unfinished learning is going to always be where we are at. And it's where I'm at. As I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, when I was going through professional development with Brett Molding, I realized the areas of unfinished learning that I had in being able to explain phenomenon that used earth and space science ideas. But if you keep in mind that with science, it may be different than other disciplines. So again, that example of my son. So at the kindergarten grade levels, I believe that's a space where students might be able to make observations, let's say, about a puddle after a rainy day or night. And they might notice over the course of a couple of days that that rain puddle goes away, right? Now, if students have those experiences early on, they can use them later to then understand the science ideas that explain why that puddle's going away. But for students, when it comes to unfinished learning in science, I think the idea of acceleration is really key. And what we mean by that is if you have students, let's say next year, who maybe didn't get all of the science ideas or didn't have all of the experiences with science and engineering practices and cross-cutting concepts that they might have had this year not occurred and had some level of disruptions. Next year, as a science teacher, whenever I stay on my grade level standards, let's say I'm teaching 8th grade, what I would want to think about is, for every investigation I'm setting up, what are those scaffolds in place to help students bring whatever they have in their way of their experiences and understandings of science ideas, and then I'm going to work to help them build those ideas. Remember, refinement of ideas to explain phenomenon. So it doesn't necessarily mean that I as a teacher need to think about what needs to be retaught from last year or previous years that they may have missed out on. But what it means is I need to have some really good touch points for formative assessment in my investigation to understand what is their current understanding and what is their current ability, and then what am I going to need to intentionally bring in to help them build upon those understandings. With my son, he didn't have an understanding of changes of states of matter, right? I could tell when we were talking that he wasn't making those connections. And really at middle school, he should have had some level of understanding with that. But it didn't mean I needed to go back and do a whole new reteaching about states of matter and how what may cause a liquid to turn into a gas or a liquid to turn into a solid. But in the middle of us talking about the liquid on the outside of the cups, that became a natural part of the discussion. I realized he didn't have that piece of information. I found a way to bring that into the conversation. And in the middle of that investigation, he gained that understanding and was able to then really move on in his understanding and more complex science ideas that helped him explain why that liquid was showing up on the outside of the cup. So
kind of
I don't know
just in time, not just in case thinking. Yeah.
I think that's a great way to put it. Just in time, not just in case. But again, you have to be really intentional. about having those touch points to see where your students are at in their understanding. And I think this way of teaching science, where students are engaged in an investigation of a phenomenon or a design project, lends itself nicely to this idea of acceleration and not going back and remediation or reteaching. I think more traditional ways of teaching science would require that, because you're trying to have students sort of collect factual information and more factual information. And if they miss out on a point of time in that factual information, you've got to go back and reteach it. But that's not what we're talking about with science instruction today. It's about big ideas and building the level of sophistication of understanding of those big ideas so that you can explain a phenomenon or design a solution. And if that's the goal, then you really can layer on those understandings in that just-in-time setting.
What else do you hope we don't do in response to this disrupted learning? Like, what are things that might come from a very good place, but we know actually doesn't work?
Yeah, so a couple of things, actually. So one, I've already talked about a little bit, this idea of, for science, spending a lot of time reteaching facts that may not and really don't relate to the big ideas of science. But the other is, I will say that I served as the president of the Council of State Science Supervisors more recently. I'm now a former president of that organization, and that's all members, state science supervisors from all of the states and territories that are part of that organization. So it's a wonderful group of people and just amazing minds in science education. And I think one of the things we're all concerned about in all of our states is the idea that there may be a tendency to reduce time on science or eliminate science for some students if it's deemed that those students are needing support in other disciplinary areas like literacy or mathematics. And when we think about the number of careers that students will go into that connect to science or engineering, it's vast. It's just incomprehensible how many careers are available to students in those spaces. And what we know to be true is students from a young age start to determine whether or not they're good at science or not. And if they miss those experiences in these rich experiences we've been talking about, or if they're reduced to reading about science as their only way of knowing and understanding, then we could miss out on really supporting interest and curiosity in the field of science and engineering in a way that we wouldn't see the outcome of that for a number of years if students don't have access to those experiences in elementary, because we may be trying to compensate for other areas. So, I think that is a real concern for us when we think about our workforce development. It's not just about what our high school students are doing to be prepared for college when it comes to science and engineering. It's about what we're seeding at these early grade levels right now, or not seeding, that could have impacts, far down the line. Yep. So,
I fear we already see that happening, right? We already see that prioritization often minimizing time on science.
Yeah, and I would say if you're curious about the elementary realm in particular, Dr. Nell Duke would be a great person to speak to. But I love when she really brings to bear, especially in this way of teaching science, engaging students in learning in the way I've spoken about today. When we think about a student, again, like my son, who takes a look at those two cups and he starts having curiosity, the first thing I would want to do in the classroom is to ask him to share his thoughts, right? So this is a lot of the speaking and listening skills that we want students to gain through English language arts or literacy. But in addition to that, I would ask him to draw out or write down his initial explanation for why that might be happening. The whole goal is that he's getting his thoughts from his brain on paper and he's able to translate that. So that in and of itself, requires strong literacy skills to make that leap to explaining your thoughts on paper. But then I would also say that as far as the reading and reading comprehension skills go, at that moment when, example, my son needed more information to build on his understanding, I might present him with a small bit of literature, or text, and ask him to read it. Like, use close reading strategies, highlight anything in that text that might help you better explain this phenomenon. Circle anything you don't understand. Put a star by anything you find really interesting that relates to your life outside of this investigation. And when he reads that text that deeply, I know the level of literacy that he's gaining, because now I'm going to ask him to take what he read in that text and let's talk about the things he didn't quite understand, or us as a group of students. What are all the things you circled in your text? Let's talk about that. Let's make sense of it. And we're probably developing vocabulary deeply when we do that. But then everything every student highlights, like my son, that helps them make sense of that phenomenon in those 2 cups. Now imagine how deeply they understand that text that was presented to them, because they're incorporating it to make sense of something, not just answer a question, but truly make deep sense of something. So when we talk about science being taught this way, everything I just sort of shared with you that has a literacy connection, those are the science and engineering practices that are in our standards and in the framework for K-12 science education. So it's not just about integration. It means it's naturally there if we leverage the opportunity to engage students in learning this way. And it's deep literacy skills that they're gaining in the context of science and engineering, which we hope they then carry on throughout their school years and into college and their careers.
I do think that we all have a lot to learn from how good science is taught. It's so powerful. And I appreciate you bringing some voice to that in this series. Thank you so much, Tiffany.
Thank you so much for having me today.